The dusty jeep came to a stop at the edge of what could barely be called a road. David stepped out and took his first breath of the thin mountain air. His lungs burned slightly as he adjusted to the altitude. Around him stretched a landscape that looked like it belonged in a fairy tale. Snow-capped peaks touched the clouds and small stone houses dotted the hillside like scattered jewels. He had been driving for 2 days to reach this remote village in Nepal. As a water engineer with a humanitarian organization, David had volunteered for this assignment because he wanted to make a real difference. Back home in California, he had a comfortable office job, but something inside him had always felt empty. He wanted to help people who truly needed it. The village of Tashigang was home to about 300 people. Most had never seen electricity or running water. David's job was simple in theory: help them build a clean water system that could serve the entire community. In practice, he knew it would be one of the hardest projects of his career. His local guide, Tenzin, greeted him with a warm smile and hands pressed together in greeting. Tenzin spoke broken English mixed with his native language, but his kind eyes made communication easier than David had expected. "Welcome, welcome," Tenzin said, helping David with his heavy bags of equipment. "Village very happy you come help." As they walked through the narrow stone paths between houses, David noticed how peaceful everything seemed. Children played with simple wooden toys while their mothers worked outside, spinning yarn or preparing food over small fires. The men were mostly out with their animals, yaks and goats that provided milk, meat, and wool for the families. But something caught David's eye that made him stop in his tracks. A young woman was carrying a large clay pot filled with water. She moved gracefully despite the heavy load, but what shocked David was what she wore around her neck. It looked like a thick metal collar, dark, heavy, and clearly handmade. The metal had strange markings carved into it, and it sat snugly around her throat. David felt his stomach drop. In all his training about different cultures, no one had mentioned anything like this. The collar looked uncomfortable and restrictive. Why would anyone wear such a thing by choice? The woman noticed David staring and quickly looked away, hurrying past them with her water pot. David turned to Tenzin with confusion written all over his face. "Tenzin, that woman. What was that around her neck?" Tenzin's cheerful expression changed slightly. He glanced in the direction the woman had gone, then back at David. Is difficult to explain. Is traditional thing." "Traditional?" David pressed. "But it looked so heavy, doesn't it hurt her?" Tenzin seemed uncomfortable with the questions. He shifted David's bags from one shoulder to the other and started walking again. Come, we show you where you stay. You tired from long journey." But David couldn't shake what he had seen. Throughout the rest of the day, as Tenzin showed him around the village and introduced him to the local leaders, David kept thinking about that metal collar. His mind raced with possibilities, none of them good. That evening he saw the woman again. She was outside a small house tending to a fire and cooking what smelled like vegetable stew. The collar was still there, catching the light from the flames. David watched from a distance as she moved around, doing various tasks. Every movement looked normal except for that strange, heavy piece of metal around her neck. Other villagers seemed to treat her with respect, even deference. They bowed slightly when they spoke to her and seemed to ask for her advice about various matters. But David's Western mind couldn't understand why someone would be respected while wearing what looked like a restraint. Over the next few days, David threw himself into his work, surveying the area for the best location to dig a well and install a water pump. But he couldn't concentrate properly. Every time he saw the woman, whose name he learned was Pemba, he felt disturbed by her situation. He watched her daily routine carefully. She woke early and helped with household tasks. She spent time with the village children, who seemed to love her and sought her out for stories and advice. She worked in a small garden, growing vegetables and herbs. She helped elderly villagers with various tasks and seemed to have a special knowledge about plants and natural remedies. But through it all, the collar never came off. David never saw her try to remove it or even adjust it. It seemed permanently fixed around her neck. During his third evening in the village, David tried again to get information from Tenzin. They were sitting outside David's small guest house, sharing tea and discussing the water project. "Tenzin, I need to ask you something," David said carefully. "That woman, Pemba, is she free to leave the village if she wants?" Tenzin looked confused. "Leave? Why she want leave? This her home, her family here. But the thing around her neck is complicated," Tenzin said quickly, clearly wanting to change the subject. "Different culture, different ways. You understand water, yes? Focus on water project. Very important for village." David felt frustrated by the evasive answers, but he didn't want to push too hard and risk offending his guide. However, his concern for Pemba continued to grow. In his mind, he began to piece together what he thought was happening. The collar looked like something designed to control someone. The way others treated her with a mixture of respect and careful distance reminded him of stories he had heard about various forms of forced servitude that still existed in remote parts of the world. His humanitarian training had covered these issues. He knew that sometimes in isolated communities, old practices persisted that the outside world would consider unacceptable. The thought that he was witnessing such a situation made his chest tight with anger and determination. David had come to this village to help with water, but now he felt he had discovered something much more important. In his mind, Pemba needed rescuing, and he might be the only person in a position to help her. As he lay in his simple bed that night, listening to the wind whistle through the mountains, David made a decision. He couldn't just focus on his water project while ignoring what he believed was a serious injustice happening right in front of him. Tomorrow, he would find a way to help Pemba, whether the villagers understood his concerns or not. After all, some things were more important than cultural sensitivity. Human freedom was one of them. He fell asleep that night convinced he was about to become a hero in a story that desperately needed one. David had been in the village for a week now, and his concern for Pemba had grown into something he couldn't ignore. Every morning, he watched her wake up before sunrise and begin her daily tasks. She would collect water from the stream, tend to the animals, and help prepare meals for her family. All of this she did with that heavy metal collar around her neck. What bothered David most was how normal everyone seemed to think this was. The other villagers treated Pemba with respect, but there was something in their behavior that made David more suspicious. They would bow slightly when greeting her, speak to her in quiet, careful tones, and often bring her their problems to solve. During his work on the water project, David noticed that Pemba had an unusual amount of knowledge about the local area. She knew which plants could be used for medicine, where the cleanest water sources were located, and how to predict changes in the weather by reading the sky and wind patterns. The villagers clearly valued her wisdom, but David couldn't shake the feeling that this was all part of some twisted system. On the 8th day, David saw something that made his blood boil. Pemba was working in the hot sun, carrying heavy stones, to help build a new wall for the village school. Sweat dripped down her face, and David could see the metal collar chafing against her skin where it rubbed. She never complained, never asked for help, just kept working with quiet determination. "This is wrong," David muttered to himself. He had seen enough. That afternoon, David tried a different approach with Tenzin. Instead of asking direct questions, he started talking about freedom and human rights in general terms. He hoped to gauge Tenzin's reaction and maybe get some honest answers. "You know, Tenzin," David said while they examined the site for the new well, "where I come from, we believe everyone should be free to make their own choices about their life." Tenzin nodded politely. "Yes, freedom very important. Sometimes," David continued carefully, "old traditions can be harmful to people, especially women. When that happens, it's important to change those traditions." Tenzin's expression became guarded. "All traditions have reasons," he said quietly. "Not always easy to understand from outside. But surely you agree that no one should be forced to wear restraints?" Tenzin stopped walking and looked at David with confusion. "Restraints? What you mean?" David realized he had been too subtle. "The collar, Tenzin. That thing around Pemba's neck. It's not right." For a moment, Tenzin's eyes widened, with what looked like panic. Then he quickly composed himself. "Is not what you think," he said firmly. is protection, is good for her. Protection from what? David demanded. From freedom, from making her own choices? You not understand, Tenzin said, his English becoming more broken as he got upset. Is very important. She need. But Tenzin couldn't seem to find the words in English to explain. He threw up his hands in frustration and walked away, leaving David more convinced than ever that something terrible was happening. That evening, David decided to take action. He had brought various tools for the water project, including a small hacksaw that could cut through metal. If no one else would help Pemba, he would do it himself. The next morning, David followed Pemba at a distance as she went to collect water from the stream. This had become her routine. She would go alone to the water source about a mile from the village, fill her containers, and return. David saw this as the perfect opportunity to approach her without interference from the other villagers. When Pemba reached the stream, she set down her clay pots and knelt by the water's edge. David took a deep breath and approached her carefully, not wanting to startle her. Pemba, he said softly. She looked up surprised to see him. Her eyes were kind but wary. She said something in her language that David didn't understand, but her tone suggested she was asking what he wanted. David pulled out his phone and opened the translation app he had downloaded. Slowly, he typed words into the app and let it speak in her language. I want to help you, the electronic voice said. Pemba tilted her head, clearly confused. She responded in her own language, but David's app couldn't pick up her words clearly over the sound of the running water. David tried again, typing more carefully. You don't have to live like this, I can set you free. This time, Pemba's expression changed to one of alarm. She stood up quickly and backed away from David, shaking her head and speaking rapidly in her language. David couldn't understand her words, but he interpreted her reaction as fear. Fear that someone might see them talking. Fear of punishment for being caught with him. This only strengthened David's resolve. He reached into his backpack and pulled out the hacksaw, holding it up so Pemba could see what he intended to do. I'm going to cut that collar off, he said, speaking slowly and clearly while making cutting motions with his hands. You'll be free. Pemba's eyes widened in terror. She pressed her hands against the collar and shook her head violently, backing further away from David. She was speaking urgently now, pleading with him in her language, but David couldn't understand what she was saying. To David, her reaction confirmed everything he had suspected. She was so scared of her captors that she couldn't even accept help when it was offered. This was exactly the kind of psychological control that made situations like this so difficult to resolve. It's okay, David said, moving closer despite her obvious distress. I know you're scared, but I promise I'll protect you. Once this collar is off, we can get you out of here. You can come with me to the city where you'll be safe. Pemba continued to back away, but David was determined. He had come too far to give up now. In his mind, this was the moment that would define his entire trip to Nepal. This was why he had really been sent here, not just to dig a well, but to save someone who desperately needed saving. Trust me, David said, raising the hacksaw. In a few minutes, this nightmare will be over. What David didn't realize was that he was about to turn someone else's life into a real nightmare, and his good intentions were about to cause more harm than he could ever imagine. David moved closer to Pemba, hacksaw in hand, his heart pounding with what he thought was righteous determination. Pemba continued backing away, her hands protectively covering the metal collar around her neck. She was speaking rapidly in her language, her voice getting higher and more desperate with each word. Please don't be afraid, David said, trying to keep his voice calm and reassuring. I know this seems scary, but I promise everything will be okay once you're free. But Pemba wasn't listening to his words. She couldn't understand English well, enough to know what he was saying, and all she could see was a strange foreign man approaching her with a sharp metal tool, clearly intending to cut something around her neck. David finally got close enough to reach her. Pemba tried to run, but she stumbled on the rocky ground near the stream and fell to her knees. David saw this as his opportunity. He knelt beside her and gently but firmly took hold of the collar. Hold still, he said softly. This will just take a minute. The metal was harder than David had expected. The collar had been crafted with incredible skill, and the metal was thick and strong. But David was determined. He positioned the hacksaw against the collar and began cutting. The sound of metal against metal filled the air around the stream. Pemba was struggling now, trying to push David away, but he was stronger than her. In his mind, her resistance was just fear talking. He had seen this before in documentaries, about rescue situations. Victims often fought against their rescuers because they had been conditioned to fear the consequences of escape. Almost there, David muttered as the hacksaw bit deeper into the metal. Sparks flew as the blade worked through the collar. Just a little more. With a final scraping sound, the collar split apart. David pulled the two pieces away from Pemba's neck and held them up triumphantly. "There," he said with a huge smile. "You're free! You're finally free!" But instead of the gratitude and relief David expected to see, something terrible happened. Pemba's eyes rolled back in her head, and she fell forward, gasping for air. Her hands went to her throat, and she made horrible choking sounds. David's smile disappeared instantly. "Pemba, what's wrong? What's happening?" Pemba couldn't answer. She was struggling to breathe, her chest rising and falling rapidly as she fought for air. Her face was turning red, then purple. David realized with growing horror that something was very, very wrong. "Help!" David shouted toward the village, his voice echoing off the mountain walls. "Someone help us!" Pemba collapsed completely now, her body convulsing as she gasped for breath. David knelt beside her, not knowing what to do. He had basic first aid training, but nothing had prepared him for this. All he could do was try to keep her airway clear and shout for help. Within minutes, David heard running footsteps. Tenzin appeared first, followed by several other villagers. When Tenzin saw Pemba on the ground and the broken collar in David's hands, his face went completely white. "What you do?" Tenzin screamed, rushing to Pemba's side. "What you do to her?" I freed her," David stammered. "I cut off the collar. But something's wrong. She can't breathe." Tenzin knelt beside Pemba and began speaking urgently in their language. Other villagers gathered around, and David heard gasps and cries of distress. An elderly man who David recognized as one of the village leaders pushed through the crowd and dropped to his knees beside Pemba. The old man looked at the broken collar, then at David, and his eyes filled with a mixture of grief and anger that made David's stomach turn to ice. "You don't understand," Tenzin said, his voice shaking with emotion. "That not collar. That not for keeping her. That for helping her breathe." David felt the world spinning around him. "What do you mean?" "She born with problem," Tenzin explained quickly while trying to help Pemba. "Her throat not work right. That device help her get air. Without it, she cannot breathe in mountain air." The full weight of what David had done hit him like a physical blow. "No," he whispered. "No, that's not possible. It looked like collar, yes," Tenzin said bitterly. "But was breathing help. Made special for her when she was child. Only one like it. Made by master craftsman who died 5 years ago." David stared at the broken pieces of metal in his hands. Now that he looked more closely, he could see that the interior of the device was smooth and carefully shaped. There were small holes and channels that he hadn't noticed before, clearly designed to help with airflow, not to restrict it. "We need to get her to a hospital," David said desperately. "There has to be something we can do." "Hospital 2 days away," Tenzin replied. "Roads too dangerous for car in her condition, and helicopter cannot come in this weather." David looked up at the sky. Dark clouds were gathering around the mountain peaks and the wind was picking up. Even if they could call for help, no rescue helicopter would be able to fly in these conditions. More villagers arrived, including Pemba's family members. David watched as her mother knelt beside her, tears streaming down her face. An elderly woman who appeared to be Pemba's grandmother began chanting in their language, her hands moving in traditional healing gestures. "She was not prisoner," Tenzin said quietly to David. "She is healer." Very important person in village. People come to her for medicine, for advice. She know all about plants, about weather, about many things. We respect her very much. David felt sick to his stomach. But why didn't you tell me? I try to tell you is complicated, Tenzin replied. You not want to listen. You think you know everything about our ways. David realized that every interaction he had observed between Pemba and the villagers had been completely misunderstood. The respect they showed her wasn't the cautious behavior of people around someone who was controlled. It was the genuine reverence they felt for someone who was gifted and wise. Her knowledge of plants and weather wasn't the result of forced labor. It was her calling as a traditional healer. What can I do? David asked desperately. There has to be something. We try to help her, Tenzin said. But without the breathing device is very hard. That device was made just for her. Exact size, exact shape for her throat. Cannot be replaced. Easily. David looked at Pemba, who was still struggling for each breath. Her family surrounded her, offering what comfort they could. But David could see the fear in their eyes. He had come to this village to help people, and instead, he had potentially killed someone with his ignorance and arrogance. The worst part was that Pemba had tried to stop him. She had known what would happen if the device was removed, and she had tried desperately to prevent it. But David had been so convinced of his own righteousness that he had ignored her pleas. Now, as the mountain wind grew stronger and the clouds gathered overhead, David faced the terrible possibility that his attempt to be a hero had turned him into something much worse. The villagers carefully carried Pemba back to her family's house, with David following behind in stunned silence. His mind was racing, trying to process the magnitude of what he had done. Every step felt like walking through a nightmare that he couldn't wake up from. Inside the small stone house, they laid Pemba on a bed of thick woolen blankets. Her breathing was shallow and labored, each breath a struggle that David could hear from across the room. Her mother sat beside her, holding her hand and whispering prayers in their language. How long can she survive without the device? David asked Tenzin quietly. Tenzin shook his head grimly. Not long at this altitude. The air here is thin. For someone with her condition without help breathing, maybe few days, maybe less. David felt his knees go weak. There has to be something we can do. What about the nearest medical facility? District Hospital in Pokhara, Tenzin replied, but is 2 days by jeep on dangerous mountain roads. In her condition, the journey would kill her before we arrive. What about a helicopter evacuation? Tenzin pointed toward the window where dark clouds were swirling around the mountain peaks. Weather getting worse. Monsoon season starting early this year. No helicopter can fly in these conditions. David pulled out his satellite phone, a device his organization had given him for emergencies. His hands shook as he dialed the number. For his headquarters in Kathmandu. This is David Chen, Project ID 847, he said when someone answered. I need immediate medical evacuation for a local resident. It's life-threatening. The voice on the other end was professional but not encouraging. What's the nature of the emergency? David hesitated. How could he explain what had happened without admitting his terrible mistake? A young woman is having severe breathing difficulties. She needs immediate hospital care. I'm checking weather reports for your area, the voice said. I'm sorry, but all helicopter flights are grounded due to storm conditions. Earliest possible evacuation would be in 3 to 4 days, weather permitting. She doesn't have 3 to 4 days, David said desperately. I understand your concern, but we can't risk a flight crew in these conditions. Is there any local medical support available? David looked around the room. Pemba's grandmother was preparing traditional herbs, grinding them into a paste with practiced movements. An elderly man who appeared to be the village healer was examining Pemba, checking her pulse and looking at her throat. There's traditional healing, David said into the phone. That will have to do for now. I'll put you on priority list for evacuation as soon as weather clears. David ended the call and stared at the phone in his hands. He had never felt so helpless in his life. Let me see the broken device, David said to Tenzin. Maybe I can figure out how to repair it. Tenzin brought him the 2 pieces of the metal collar. Now that David knew what he was looking at, he could see the intricate craftsmanship. The device had been carefully shaped to fit around Pemba's throat, with smooth channels and openings designed to help airflow. The metal itself was an alloy he didn't recognize, probably a mixture of local metals chosen for their properties. "This is incredible work," David murmured, turning the pieces over in his hands. "Who made this?" "Master metalworker named Karma," Tenzin explained. "He learned from his father, who learned from his father. Very old knowledge. But Karma died 5 years ago. His son know little bit, but not enough for something this important." David examined the cut he had made. The hacksaw had created jagged edges that would be impossible to rejoin properly. Even if he could weld the pieces back together, the rough edges would hurt Pemba's throat and might not provide the proper airflow. "What if we try to make a temporary replacement?" David asked. "I have some materials from the water project. Maybe we can create something to help her until we can get her to a hospital." The village healer, an ancient man named Lobsang, approached them. He spoke to Tenzin in their language, gesturing toward David and the broken device. "He says maybe, possible," Tenzin translated, "but very dangerous. If we make mistake, could make things worse." "Things can't get much worse," David said grimly. "What does he need?" Working together, David and Lobsang began trying to create a temporary breathing aid. David contributed his engineering knowledge and modern materials, flexible plastic tubing from his water equipment, metal fittings, and tools. Lobsang provided his understanding of traditional healing and knowledge of how the original device had worked. The work was painstakingly slow. Every few minutes, they would check on Pemba, whose condition seemed to be getting worse. Her lips were starting to turn blue from lack of oxygen, and her family gathered around her bed, clearly preparing for the worst. "Tell me about her condition," David asked while they worked. "When did it start?" "She born this way," Tenzin explained. "Her throat, the airways, they not form right. In the city, maybe doctors could fix with surgery, but here we must find other way." How did they figure out that a device like this would help? Karma's grandfather was healer too. He tried many things. Finally, he make first breathing helper for child in village long time ago. When Pemba born with same problem, family asked Karma to make one for her. David realized he was learning about a tradition of innovation and healing that stretched back generations. These people hadn't just accepted that children with breathing problems would die. They had found a solution using the knowledge and skills available to them. After 6 hours of careful work, they had created something that looked like it might work. It wasn't as elegant as the original device, but it had the basic shape and airflow channels that Pemba needed. "We try now?" Lobsang asked through Tenzin. David looked at their makeshift creation, then at Pemba, who was barely conscious now. Her breathing had become so labored that each breath looked like it might be her last. "We have to try," David said. "We don't have any choice." But as they approached Pemba's bedside with their improvised device, David felt the full weight of responsibility on his shoulders. If this didn't work, he would have to live with the knowledge that his cultural ignorance and stubborn determination to be a hero had cost an innocent person their life. The whole village seemed to hold its breath as they prepared to test whether their desperate solution would be enough to save the woman David had nearly killed with his good intentions. David's hands trembled as he and Lobsang carefully positioned their makeshift breathing device around Pemba's neck. The whole room fell silent except for the sound of Pemba's labored breathing. Her family watched with a mixture of hope and fear, knowing this might be their last chance to save her. The device looked crude compared to the beautiful metalwork that David had destroyed, but it had the basic shape they needed. David had used flexible medical tubing from his first aid kit, combined with metal fittings from his water equipment. Lobsang had shaped it according to his memory of how the original device worked. "Very gentle," Lobsang whispered as they secured the device in place. For a few terrifying moments, nothing happened. Pemba continued to struggle for breath, her face still pale and her lips blue. David felt his heart sink, thinking their desperate attempt had failed. Then slowly, Pemba's breathing began to improve. The horrible gasping sounds became quieter, and her chest rose and fell more easily. Color started returning to her face, and her family members began to cry with relief. "Is working," Tenzin said quietly. "She getting better." But David knew this was only a temporary solution. The improvised device might help for now, but it wasn't designed to last. They still needed to get Pemba to a proper hospital where doctors could provide the medical care she really needed. 3 more days passed before the weather finally cleared enough for a helicopter evacuation. During those 3 days, David barely left Pemba's side. He constantly monitored the makeshift device, adjusting it when needed and making sure it continued to work properly. The village rallied around Pemba during her recovery. People brought food for her family, helped with daily chores, and took turns sitting with her. David watched all of this and began to understand something important about the community he had so badly misjudged. During the long hours of waiting, Tenzin shared more of Pemba's story with David. She had been born with a rare condition that affected the structure of her airway. Instead of letting her die, the village had found a way to help her live a full life. The master craftsman Karma had spent months creating the perfect device for her, working closely with traditional healers to understand exactly what she needed. "She not victim," Tenzin explained. "She is gift to village. Her condition make her understand suffering in special way. This make her very good healer. People come from other villages to see her when they sick." David learned that Pemba had been training since childhood to become a traditional healer. Her unique experience with breathing difficulties had given her deep knowledge about respiratory ailments and treatments. The respect the villagers showed her wasn't pity or fear. It was genuine admiration for her wisdom and healing abilities. When she was teenager, Tenzin continued, she saved many children during bad winter when sickness spread through valley. Her breathing device never stopped her from helping others. When the helicopter finally arrived, David accompanied Pemba to the hospital in Kathmandu. During the flight, he held her hand and promised that he would do everything in his power to help her get a proper replacement for the device he had destroyed. At the hospital, doctors were amazed by the traditional breathing device and the makeshift replacement David and Lobsang had created. Dr. Patel, the respiratory specialist who treated Pemba, was particularly interested in the original design. "This is remarkable engineering," she told David. "Whoever made this understood the patient's anatomy perfectly. It's exactly what she needed for her specific condition." Dr. Patel was able to stabilize Pemba with modern medical equipment, but she agreed that a permanent device similar to the original would be the best long-term solution. David spent the next several weeks contacting medical device manufacturers and specialists around the world, trying to find someone who could recreate what the village craftsman had made. Finally, he found a company in Germany that specialized in custom medical devices. When David showed them photos and measurements of the original device, they were impressed by its sophisticated design. Working together with Dr. Patel, they created a modern version that combined traditional knowledge with contemporary materials and manufacturing techniques. The new device was lighter and more comfortable than the original, but it worked on the same principles. It was custom-fitted to Pemba's anatomy and designed to last for many years. 3 months after the accident, David returned to the village, with Pemba and her new breathing device. The whole community came out to welcome them back. There was singing, dancing, and a feast to celebrate Pemba's recovery. But the real celebration came a few days later, when Pemba resumed her work as a healer. David watched as people came to her with their problems. A child with a persistent cough, an elderly man with joint pain, a young mother worried about her pregnancy. Pemba listened carefully to each person, examined them with gentle hands, and provided treatments using her deep knowledge of local plants and traditional healing methods. "I understand now," David told Tenzin as they watched Pemba work. "I came here thinking I needed to save someone, but I was the one who needed saving." From my own ignorance and assumptions, David's water project was eventually completed, providing clean drinking water for the entire village. But the real project had been David's education about humility, cultural understanding, and the danger of making assumptions about people and situations he didn't understand. Before leaving the village for the final time, David established a fund to support traditional healers in the region and to help preserve ancient crafting techniques like the ones Karma had used. He also created a cultural sensitivity training program for humanitarian workers, using his own story as an example of how good intentions without understanding could cause serious harm. 2 years later, David received an invitation written in careful English. Pemba was inviting him to attend her certification ceremony as a master healer. She had completed her training and was being officially recognized as one of the most skilled traditional healers in the region. David traveled back to the village for the ceremony. He watched with pride and humility as Pemba, wearing her new breathing device, was honored by healers from villages throughout the mountains. She had not only recovered from his terrible mistake, she had used the experience to deepen her understanding of healing and help even more people. During the celebration, Pemba approached David and spoke to him in the English she had been learning. "Thank you," she said simply. "For what?" David asked, confused. "I nearly killed you." Pemba smiled. "You helped me understand that healing come in many forms, traditional way, modern way, both important. Now, I can help my people even better." David realized that while his mistake had nearly been fatal, the journey of fixing it had brought together traditional and modern knowledge in a way that benefited everyone. Sometimes the most important lessons come from our worst mistakes, and the greatest service we can provide is learning to truly understand the people we want to help. As David watched Pemba work with her patients, he understood that being a helper isn't about being a hero. It's about being humble enough to listen, learn, and work alongside the people you serve.